Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, together with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the oldest and best magazine devoted to religious liberty ever. Bettina, welcome to our new podcast endeavor where we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes.
Well, thank you, Alan, and I do appreciate your ringing endorsement of Liberty Magazine.
Always.
So, Alan, I tell you what caught my eye this week, and that is a case that came out of the Fifth Circuit, and it was about religious speech in the workplace, and it's Carter versus Southwest Airlines. Have you heard of this case?
I not only have heard of it, I've talked to one of the attorneys representing the plaintiff, Miss Carter.
So interesting. Well, do you want to give us an overview of the facts, or?
Well, I haven't drilled down all that much. You and I were discussing them, but apparently Miss Carter is adamantly pro-life and was very upset by the union's support for abortion rights, and made that known in ways to the union president on social media that many would regard, that the company regarded as harassing and bullying conduct.
Right.
And she lost her job over it, but a jury agreed with her that she had been, her religious freedom rights had been violated.
Right. And I mean, I don't think there's any disagreement that the views that she held were religiously informed and shaped, but the way that she was expressing them over a period of time, I mean, when you read the facts of the case, Alan, it's it's pretty bracing.
Sending pictures of aborted fetuses.
Correct.
That sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and using some language which is very descriptive and which we probably won't employ on this podcast. So, I mean, Alan.
So, look, I litigate in this arena, right?
Okay.
And we, for years, we're trying to get Congress to pay attention to the need to reform the law to better protect religious freedom in the workplace. And what we were hit with were fears that it would that protecting religious freedom more strongly would result in people harassing others, right?
Right.
And, our view was, wait a minute, there's plenty of religious conflict. It's not just, say conservatives who oppose gay rights, but you've got, look where we are today, where Jewish kids are being harassed like crazy on American university campuses. Because of the war in Gaza. Every religious group wants to be free of harassment from those that don't like them. But here, this really begs the question, where does religious freedom give way to, hey, my freedom stops when my, fist hits your nose? When is harassment no longer religious freedom?
Right. And no one is denying that she has a right to her views and she has a right to express them in any way she chooses. But then when does an employer have the right to step in and say, hey, this is against our workplace code, this is against our policies, and we will terminate your employment? Now, a jury, as you said, Alan, found that she was unfairly terminated from her position. Clearly, I'm guessing this is going to be appealed. But, where does that leave the average person who, is going to their 9-to-5 job? How can they know what are the parameters in which they can operate in terms of expressing their religious views?
I would advise my clients to refrain from harassment.
That seems pretty a low
right?
bar, Alan.
If somebody, you can express your views, but when somebody says, I don't want to hear it, then you stop. It's
Right.
very simple, So anyway, this will definitely be the subject of more discussion because it's a cutting edge issue in employment law and the use of social media. but we have a wonderful guest today, and we need to get right to our interview.
Sounds good. So, we are delighted to have with us Professor Andrew Polk, who is an award winning teacher and scholar of American religious history. He's also an associate professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. And he is the author of a book which I appreciated so much, Faith in Freedom: Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. So, welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, let's start with your book. I mean, Christian nationalism is very much top of mind for many in America, especially since January 6, 2021. So what myths surround the idea of America as a Christian nation, what myths does your book engage with?
Yep. The key one is the idea that what we think of as civil religion or patriotic religion is somehow endemic and original to the United States, right? I mean, there's always been some idea of America as a Christian nation, although originally there were a bunch of different forms of Christian. They were all trying. They were not all equal, right? In some sense, religious liberty was the way that it was a negotiation, right? That we all kind of get in this together. No one can gain power, so we shouldn't, all be fighting. We can all get along. There's enough land. What happens in the 20th century that surprised me, and I think the phrase that was a lead into this that y'all may have heard before, is families that pray together stay together, right? This wonderful that I grew up with, right? This idea that we come together and the family unit, and if we pray together, then we're connected to God and we're good patriotic Americans. We have all of this. It turns out that was created by American advertising executives on behalf of the American government in the 1940s and 50s. I did not expect this in any way. That my idea of civil religion had always been, because I'm a religious person myself, right? I have a deep Christian faith. I have an understanding of theology and ethics and the world and how it applies to politics. And so I kind of thought that there was, in some sense, this civil religion was tied together by people with corrupting the religious element, right? That there's some preachers who wanted power or some politicians who are pandering. It turns out it was significantly more institutional than that. The shortest version is that I found that Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower explicitly, consciously worked with advertisers, propagandists, their own government propagandists, to unite the country in religion, right? Not under religion, but they Roosevelt at the beginning. The country has to come together because America. This is before America entered the Second World War, but he knew they were going to. So how do you unite Americans that are so diverse? You can't talk about race and ethnicity. You can't talk about class. They're too divisive. But he decided, in the end, everyone's either a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew, and those are all the same thing anyway, right? That they're just at their core this Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Which only started, that phrase, in the 30s. That's what Americans are, and so we can be diverse, but in the end, we're all the same. We're all American, and the American mattered more than Catholic, Protestant, or Jew, right? That's what brought us all together. So that was the key point that surprised and, quite frankly, disturbed me as I was going through the research.
So we've always had civil religion.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, to put this in context, how does what the series of presidents did in the 20th century change what was already existing in terms of American civil religion? I'm thinking back to the battles of the late 1800s, with battles over the King James Bible in public schools,
Yep.
and Catholics feeling excluded. And you have Blaine amendments, which are imposing a kind of strict separation of church and state that denies funding to religious schools. And so there was certainly a lot of conflict among religions. You had the first waves of large waves of Jewish immigration, of Catholic immigration. So, how does it look different come the 1930s and the lead up? We're in a Great Depression. We need to pull out of it. We're preparing for war. How does it look different from what came before?
I I think the key difference is the amount of power, money, and influence that were put into the idea, right? That this was at its heart originally a political project. Roosevelt and Truman were at least somewhat concerned with kind of getting religious leaders and movements. Roosevelt was absolutely concerned with this. If you just get all the religious leaders to just say the same thing, then all religious people will follow them. And he found out very quickly that is not true at all. Uh, but it was the purpose behind the religion, right? So if it is an American religion, Americans at their heart are religious, Protestant, Catholics, Jews, the Judeo Christian foundation, the application of that was always towards political means, right? So during the war, it was that we fight the Second World War, right? We go in, we are fighting for religious freedom, and the chief, there was something called the Office of War Information that was specifically a government propagandist. But the group that was better at it was the War Advertising Council, which were literally just advertising executives that worried the government was going to shut them down during the Second World War. Because their whole business was convincing people to buy things they didn't necessarily need. That doesn't go over well in a time of war when everyone's supposed to be pulling together. So they said, we're really good at convincing people. You tell us what you want to tell them. So they did Rosie the Riveter, right? And all this stuff, right? Smokey the Bear. But it was also this idea that religion is what keeps Americans together, and religious Americans fight for this in this way. And then especially during the early Cold War, all of that language just from Nazis got recycled to Soviets, to communists. They literally just used the same type and changed the words sometimes. But the correlation of it was, because we're all religious Americans, we fight for religious freedom. And since we're fighting for religious freedom, we're also fighting for a free market economics, because, right, the godless communists, it's a quote unquote religious system and political and economic, and they hate our religious freedom. So we must be free market economics, right? And then we must also have a large standing military, which used to be anathema in American history, right? That was the death knell of democracy. But in the mid 20th century, where we can't raise up an army again and teach them the technology, we have to have a large standing army in the new world. Well, how do you convince all of Americans of this? Well, the way they discovered was because we are the land of religious freedom, and they want to take it away. They want to take away God from you. So be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. And the only way we really do this, we have a large standing military, that we support free market economics, and you never, ever criticize the United States, particularly when it comes to racial injustice, because that only helps the enemy. And so it was the combination of these things together that created the package that I think we all kind of deal with today. Of why on earth does your religious person, therefore, like capitalism and free market economics is the only way, and a lot of this stuff doesn't make a ton of sense together, but it's because it was created as a package that everyone could get on board with.
So religious freedom itself is not a bad thing. I mean, clearly.
Yep.
And religion
We have a
itself,
show devoted to it, Bettina.
right,
That's right.
and a magazine. And religion is not a bad thing.
Yep.
So what is it that is disturbing about the conflation of, citizenship or national identity with religion? And piggybacking on that, what is the legacy that we're seeing today in your mind from that conflation?
Well, I would go back to what Alan said a little bit ago, right? When you look in the early 20th century, even, I mean, so I'm here in Tennessee, right? So the Scopes monkey trial was in Dayton, Tennessee, right? If you know of this, right? This was the way when quote unquote conservatives and liberals were fighting religiously in the early 20th century. It was over the nature of Scripture, right? The authority of Scripture, what you take literally, what is figurative, how does ethics play out in the world? These are religious questions, right? By the time you get to the late 50s, after this process, right, these massive advertising campaigns. The biggest was Religion in American Life. That's where families that pray together, that stay together came from. Um, After this, even self-avowed conservative or liberal Protestants or Catholics, when they argue with the other, right, the other side, what they argue over is no longer about biblical authority, but the proper role of the United Nations in the world, right? It's about military policy, right? If you go now and what are the great divisions of our country, most of them aren't ethical, theological, or doctrinal. The things that we worry about are governmental policies, of immigration, of the way, but not immigration is a great example, not ethically or theologically, right? Not a discussion of, okay, we're people in a messy world. We're dealing with other human beings created in the image of God just like us, loved by God just like us. But in this messy world, how do we negotiate this with national boundaries, and how do we keep safety? And that's not the discussion. It is a matter of, if you love God, you must somehow keep these people out in this conflation of the civil religion. That to love America in a very specific way becomes love of God itself. That's the thing that is most disturbing to me. That religion by this legacy is defined not by theology and ethics, not by Jesus, right? The gospel of Jesus, but somehow by a political standard. And that becomes faith itself. That's the part that's so terrifying to me.
So is that where the title of your book comes from, in part, Faith in Freedom? That somehow our, American values of religious freedom, of economic freedom, have supplanted, in some sense, at least in our hearts, our real faith in Jesus.
I think so. And I think in a way that, so the origin of that, all three of those presidents use that term, right? What we want to give to America is a faith in freedom. But early on in this, the Advertising Council, they had multiple campaigns. One of them was the Freedom Train. And it was an actual literal train that went around the country, and people would come and see fantastic documents, like original copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. It's insane that they just toured this around the country. But they called it Thomas Darcy Brophy. Yeah, it's the way. Yeah, who's going to go steal something from the train or blow it up? The goal of this was, according to the organizer, reselling Americans on Americanism.
Huh.
So the literal goal was to tell Americans what America was. And they have all the documentation of this. This wasn't like a secret smoky back room with a conspiracy going on. They didn't hide it. They had intense debates over how they would define America. And the original leading idea was, this goes, y'all, was liberty or equality. All right, that was the idea. Let's go with liberty or equality and get through. And then the advertising executives were like, that doesn't play in the South. You can define America by equality in the South with Jim Crow going, right? So what they decided was freedom was just better. Because what does freedom mean? Being free from oppression, right? Who doesn't love freedom, right? Who's like, freedom's okay. Everyone loves freedom, and it means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. And the advertisers really like the play. Freedom of religion becomes a key thing, but free market also plays, and a free world also plays, right? It is literally just the sound of it fits. And no one's going to say, no, we don't like freedom. We're against freedom. But it's not religious freedom as in people are able to do what they want as they want and worship their God in their own choosing. That's fine, as long as you follow these political rules that go along with it, right? The goal of it, the image, was not an image of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was an image of the preferred political policies of the ones in charge of the program. And that's the great danger, and I worry the great legacy as well.
So, when I first read your book, I'd just become editor of Liberty magazine, actually. It was one of the first articles I commissioned from you. And I was just absolutely struck by how intentional this was, and how the records exist. You obviously accessed these records and built up such a compelling history of what happened. And my question was, why don't more people know about this? And my next question is, if they did know about it, how would that change? Would that change the situation, how people sort of understand freedom within the American context? Would it make a difference in our current political discourse?
Ooh, I don't think I can ever answer the second one because I don't. I think I've lost touch on what counts and what doesn't anymore in the public sphere. I think a lot of it has to do not necessarily with the words or the ideas, but uh, the feelings, the emotions, right? Of being afraid, of feeling powerless, of feeling oppressed because you've lost power, because you're actually oppressed, right? There's a lot of this together. Um, why don't people know about it? I think part of it is just it's just the work of history, right? I mean, this is in the 1940s and 50s. We're not that far from it, and so as more people and there have been excellent books that came out in the first 5 years or so before mine came out, 5 to 10 years, that do excellent parts of this story putting together. Um, but I also think it's a bad story, right? One of my what my students have called Polkisms, which just means things that I say constantly. That they're like, yeah, that's one of those things he always says. Is people tell stories of the past to give meaning to the present, right?
Right.
We're not always terribly interested about the trivial facts of history. We're telling a story. The founding fathers are the easy of this, right? When people fight over the founding fathers, one, most of us don't know who they are, right? It's like two generations, like it's just throwing in there. We know the big names. We don't know. When we fight over them, we're not worried about what John Adams said. We're making a point about John Adams to say what America was supposed to be, what it isn't now, and what it should be in the future.
One of the things I think I heard you say is that one of the things that was being sold was the fear of losing our freedom and the need to
Yes.
unite around preserving our freedom. Now, there's two themes that I remember from my earliest days involved with religious freedom. One was Chuck Colson's warning in Kingdoms in Conflict about how easily the religious leaders are manipulated by politicians. But the other one is how prevalent is the marketing of fear for political and religious power and money purposes. And I've always been very skeptical of, especially in light of the biblical injunction repeated 100 times that believers should not be afraid.
That's right. The difficulty is in that dynamic, right? That when most people, the faith that we have is certainly from reading scripture. It's certainly from going to church. It's certainly from being with people, reading theology and going. But for most people in the pews, especially, they're not terribly interested in a bunch of doctrine and theology. Not because they're dumb or don't have a true faith, because they have lives, right? And so part of those stories, the narratives, right? We tell stories of the past, give meaning to the present. A lot of times what we want is that meaning. We want, I think, that the world is chaotic enough, right? If anyone's paid attention lately, it's very chaotic, right? A raging dumpster fire, seemingly. What we want is order. We want the world to make sense. We want to be safe and secure and okay. And this has always been the temptation of people organizing together in societies. It's a lot easier to just go with, oh, that person is gonna help me. And we've oriented politics to be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Only I can save you. It's not a stretch to include religion in that aspect, right? And I think part of the legacies that we're getting now come from the way that was originally used in a time of war. Like this, I don't think this could have happened at a different time. The beginning of mass media, the world literally at war, the immediate transition into the Cold War. I just don't think people would ever listen in a way, and the government couldn't have enough overreaching power in that way, except for that time period. But we're still living with that legacy to where good patriotic religion is political it's patriotic, maybe. I'm not even sure it's patriotic, but I'm pretty confident it has very little to do with the gospel.
We are entering an election cycle, and people are going to be hearing a lot of rhetoric. They're going to be listening to debates and speeches. What phrases for you raises red flags? What when people hear certain words or phrases or ideas, when should they be on alert?
I think the biggest key is not necessarily the original phrases, is what immediately follows. Right. So when people talk about, America's obviously founded as a Christian nation because we, pledge allegiance to the flag under God. Right. We have "In God We Trust" as our national motto. All of those were the 1950s, by the way. All of those came into "In God We Trust" was on the coinage during the Civil War, but it was put on the coinage because the Confederacy had God in their Constitution and on their money. And they desperately, Northern ministers desperately wanted Lincoln to do it. And he would not change the Constitution, put this stuff. So he gave them "In God We Trust" on the coinage, basically as a "leave me alone" thing. Right. So there's a long journey to this. What comes next is, if you hear people talking about the love of God and what it is, and they immediately apply that not to living human beings made in the image of God, but they apply that to power and position for them, it should be an immediate red flag. Now, one political party certainly does this more than the other, but both do it, right? This idea of high-ranging ideals and morals, now vote for me and do this, right? If it's an ethical or theological conversation, it fits. When it's immediately a political conversation, I think we should all be incredibly wary.
Well, all politicians manipulate God for their own purposes. They all say, "God bless America."
Yep.
And yes, we can all pray, "God bless America," but they're not saying it for that purpose. They're saying it, the implied message is vote for me because I'm God's man.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, thank you so much for a discussion that's both sobering and fascinating. And we will be on the lookout as those politicians roll out their speeches in the coming months.
That's right. Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bettina, that was just a fantastic interview, and I think a real eye-opener in terms of how we perceive the relationship between church and state, and just a reminder of how much political manipulation there is of the faith community for political purposes. It's just extraordinary history.
I mean, it is stunning, Alan. I mean, and in his book, and you see these images, he paints these pictures of ad men and businessmen. It's like an episode of Mad Men, right? These guys sitting around the table and, smoking their cigars or whatever, and coming up with these very manipulative, very intentional ideas for manipulating the American psyche. And hey, they succeeded.
Right. They did. And, what they have created is they didn't create the civil religion out of whole cloth. It was already there to some extent, right? It's been part of American life forever, but they really manipulated it in a very idolatrous fashion, that to be American is to be a certain type of Christian that essentially is an idolatrous believer because, it blends God and country, faith and patriotism in ways that are not authentic to the worship of Jesus.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think it'll be the subject of many, many more discussions going forward, especially in this very interesting season that we're about to embark upon.
Oy. I'm just reminded of the ancient Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times." It's a curse. I'm sorry. It's not just a proverb. It's a curse. And things are a little too interesting for me. I could use a little less interesting times.
Yeah, just a touch. This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause here with Alan Reineck, And until next time, remember,
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.